The mid-July heat hung heavy over the small town of Clearview, a kind of humidity that stuck your shirt to your back the moment you stepped out of the car. But for Brian Thompson, it felt like a ghost he hadn't touched in over a decade. He parked his battered pickup truck, the one he had driven across 3 states. Lines to get here in the cracked asphalt, lot of the old diner on Main Street staring through the windshield at a town that looked both remarkably preserved and painfully different. It had been 11 years since he had packed a single duffel bag and left in the middle of the night, driven by a restless ambition that told him this town was too small for the fire that burned inside him. He had wanted to save the world, or at least that's what he told himself when he joined the elite hotshot crews out west, chasing wildfires across California and Montana, seeking adrenaline and purpose in the smoke and ash. Now Hachi, 35, his knees clicked when he walked. His skin was weathered by too much sun and soot, and the silence of his empty apartment in Oregon had become louder than the roar of any fire he had ever fought. He had returned not as a conqueror, but as a man looking for the pieces of himself he had discarded along the way, specifically the piece that belonged to Amy Young. He ordered a black coffee at the counter, keeping his head low, hoping the waitress would unrecognize him as the Thompson kid who skipped town right after high school graduation, leaving his high school sweetheart with nothing but a note and a broken promise. The coffee tasted burnt, just like he remembered, and the nostalgia hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't even sure if Amy Young still lived here. For 11 years, he had maintained a coward, S.C. Haju Silons, convinced that a clean break was better for her, that she would find someone who wanted the picket fence and the quiet life he had despised. But as the years ground on, the faces of the people he saved and the fires began to blur, and the only face that remained sharp in his memory was hers the way she looked the night he told her he was thinking about leaving. The fear in her eyes that he had chosen to ignore. He finished his coffee, left a tip that was too large for the order, and drove toward the neighborhood where her parents used to live, the truck tires humming a low, mournful tune on the pavement. The street was lined with oak trees that had grown thicker and taller, casting long shadows over the modest suburban homes. He slowed down as he approached the blue house at the end of the cul-de-sac, the place where he had shared his first kiss on the porch swing. To his surprise, the house didn't look like it belonged to her parents anymore. There was a chaotic vitality to the yard that spoke of a younger generation. A tricycle lay overturned near the mailbox, and a garden hose snaked across the driveway. Brian Thompson parked 3 houses down, killing the engine, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have a speech. He just needed to see if she was happy, a selfish curiosity that had ignored him during the long, sleepless nights at the fire station. He rolled down the window, the summer breeze carrying the scent of cut grass and charcoal from a grill, and that's when he saw her. The front door of the blue house opened, and Amy Young stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish. She was more beautiful than the snapshot in his memory, though the years had etched fine lines around her eyes, and there was a weariness in her posture that hadn't been there at 22. She was wearing faded jeans and a t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, the uniform of a woman who didn't have time for vanity. Brian felt the breath catch in his throat. He wanted to open the door and run to her, but he remained frozen, an intruder in a life he had forfeited. She shouted something toward the backyard, her voice carrying that familiar mix of sternness and warmth, and a moment later, the sound of laughter erupted from behind the house. Brian watched, transfixed, as 2 boys sprinted around the corner of the garage, chasing a golden retriever that was barking joyfully. They were blurs of motion at first, just energy and noise. But as they slowed down to wrestle the dog for a frisbee, Brian felt the world tilt on its axis. The boys were identical twins, roughly 9 years old, with unruly dark hair that curled at the nape of the neck, just like his did. They had the same square jawline that Brian saw in the mirror every morning while shaving, the same lanky, athletic build that had made Brian a track star in high school. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white, his brain struggling to process the impossible mathematics of what he was seeing. He had been gone for 11 years. The boys looked to be 9. The timeline slammed into him with the force of a backdraft. If Amy had been pregnant when he left, or shortly before, no, he had left before she would have started showing. The realization washed over him, cold and paralyzing. He had a family. He had du sens. One of the boys, the one wearing a red baseball jersey, looked up toward the street, shielding his eyes from the sun. For a split second, he looked directly at the strange truck parked down the road, and Brian saw his own eyes staring back at Himadi, inquisitive hazel that belonged to the Thompson bloodline. Amy walked down the steps and ruffled the boy's hair, saying something that made him laugh, a sound that drifted through Brian's open window and settled in the hollow of his chest. She didn't know he was there. She was living a life he had no part in, raising children he had never met, sons who shared his DNA but didn't know his name. The shame was immediate and suffocating. He had thought he was the hero of his own story, the brave firefighter saving lives. But in that moment, sitting in his truck while his secret family played on the lawn, he felt like the villain. He watched them for another 20 minutes, unable to drive away but terrified to step out. He saw the way the other twin, the one in the blue shirt, scraped his knee on the pavement, and how Amy immediately knelt, checking the wound with the practiced efficiency of a mother who had done this 1,000 times alone. He saw the way the boys interacted, a secret language of nudges and looks that only twins possessed. He realized he had missed everything. The first steps, the first words, the fevers, the nightmares, the birthdays. He had been out fighting fires, saving strangers' houses, while his own foundation had been built without him. The irony tasted bitter. He had left to find a legacy, to do something important. And the most important thing he could have ever done was right here, playing on a lawn in Clearview, Ohio. Finally, Amy looked up, her gaze lingering on the truck. She squinted, a frown creasing her forehead, and Brian knew he had been spotted. He couldn't just drive away now. That would be running away twice. And he wasn't that scared kid anymore. He took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped out into the heat. He didn't walk with the swagger he used to have. He walked slowly, his boots heavy on the asphalt, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. As he got closer, Amy froze. The towel dropped from her hand onto the porch. The boys stopped playing, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, the way the air seemed to suck out of the yard. "Amy," Brian said, his voice raspy, stopping at the edge of the driveway. She stared at him, her face draining of color, her eyes widening in a mixture of shock and something that looked like horror. She whispered, the name sounding foreign on her tongue after a decade of silence. The boys looked from their mother to the stranger, confusion knitting their identical brows. The one in the red jersey asked, taking a protective step toward her. Brian looked at the boy his son Nan felt a lump form in his throat, so large he could barely speak. He looked back at Amy, searching for a sign of welcome, a sign of anger, anything other than the devastating shock that paralyzed her. I was just passing through," he stammered, a stupid lie that fooled no one. Amy found her voice then, and it was sharp, brittle. "You didn't know what, Brian?" She stepped off the porch, positioning herself slightly in front of the twins, a subconscious shielding motion that cut Brian deeper than any insult could have. "I wanted to see you," he admitted, his voice dropped into a murmur so the kids wouldn't hear the desperation in it. 11 years, she said, the anger finally breaking through the shock. "You want to apologize after 11 years? I didn't know about them," Brian said, gesturing vaguely toward the boys, his eyes watering. "You changed your number," she snapped, tears welling in her eyes now, hot and angry. "You left a note on the kitchen counter and disappeared." "Where was I supposed to send the message, Brian?" "To the fire department in California." The boys were silent, watching the exchange with wide eyes. They were smart. Brian could see the gears turning in their heads. They saw the resemblance to... They were looking at a man who was a taller, older, scarred version of themselves. Brian started, but he couldn't finish the sentence. "Yes," Amy said, her voice trembling. The word hung in the humid air between them, heavy and absolute. Brian looked at the twins, really looked at them, and felt his knees go weak. He had missed a lifetime. He was a father to 9-year-old boys who thought he was a stranger. The weight of his abandonment crashed down on him. And for the first time in his life, the firefighter didn't know how to put out the fire he had started. He stood there, stripped of his accolades and his excuses, just a man facing the wreckage of his own choices, wondering if there was anything left to salvage or if he should just turn around, get back in his truck, and disappear for good. But then the boy in the blue shirt took a step forward, curiosity overriding fear, and asked the question that would change everything. Hung in the air like the smoke after a back, stinging the eyes and forcing a confrontation with a truth that had been buried for 9 years. Amy winced, the pain of a decade's worth of secrets etched onto her face. She placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, her knuckles white. Brian felt his breath hitch, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had faced wildfires that consumed forests whole, but nothing had ever terrified him more than the earnest, confused gaze of his own son. That's a good question, Jacob, Amy said, her voice wavering but determined. She shot Brian a look that was a mixture of warning and plea, a silent directive to tread carefully on the fragile ground they were standing on. "Why don't you and Nicholas go inside for a bit? I need to talk to..." The boys, Jacob in the blue shirt and Nicholas in the red jersey, looked between the two adults, their identical frowns deepening. Nicholas asked, his voice smaller than before. He was the more sensitive of the two, Amy always said, a detail Brian had never known until this exact second. "No, sweetie, no one is in trouble," Amy assured him, forcing a tight smile. "Just go inside, okay? Get some lemonade." They hesitated, their gaze lingering on Brian one last time before they turned and trudged up the porch steps, the screen door slamming behind them with a finality that made Brian flinch. As soon as the boys were inside, Amy turned to him, her facade of control crumbling. The anger that had been simmering for 11 years boiled over, hot and righteous. She hissed, stepping closer, her index finger jabbing at his chest. "How dare you just show up here like this?" Brian held his hands up in surrender, his palms sweating. "Amy, please. I didn't come to blow anything up. I swear, I didn't know." She interrupted, her voice rising. "You would have stayed," she scoffed, a harsh sound that grated on his ears. "Brian, you left because you didn't want to be tied down. A baby, 2 babies, wouldn't have changed that. You would have resented us," he protested, though a kernel of doubt wormed its way into his gut. Was it the man he was back then? The restless 24-year-old who saw this town as a cage? Would he have been able to handle the responsibility? "I was young, Amy. I was stupid. And you did," she retorted, her eyes scanning his scarred arms, his weathered face. "You became a hero, didn't you? I saw you on the news a few years back during that big fire in Mount. They interviewed you." Her voice cracked. "And I was here changing double diapers, working 2 jobs, trying to explain to my sons why their father was Yuanta at the Dedidare Denzo or the Sak Games." Her words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He had always framed his departure as a noble quest, a search for purpose. Hearing it from her perspective, the reality of the collateral damage he had caused was devastating. He leaned against the side of the garage, his legs suddenly feeling too weak to support him. "I'm so sorry, Amy," he whispered, the words feeling wholly inadequate. "I have no right to ask for anything, but I want to know them. Please." Amy looked away, staring across the yard at the tricycle that was still overturned by the mailbox. A tear traced a path down her cheek. "I don't know if that's a good idea, Brian. They're happy. They're stable. Introducing you. It's just going to confuse them. I'm not leaving," he said, the conviction in his voice surprising even himself. "I'm done running, Amy. The fires, they don't mean anything compared to this. I want to be here." She turned back to him, her eyes searching his face for the lies she expected to find. What she saw was a man who was broken, a man who had seen too much and lost even more, a man who was finally desperately ready to come home. But trust was not something that could be repaired in an afternoon on a suburban driveway, she said, her voice quieter now, laced with a profound sadness. "Fine?" he asked eagerly. "By leaving," she said, the hope drained from his face. "Leave right now. Get in your truck and drive away? Give me time to think." Brian felt a wave of despair wash over him. It was the same ultimatum he had given himself 11 years ago. Only this Chimi, the stakes were infinitely higher. He wanted to argue, to beg, to plead his case, but he saw the absolute resolve in her eyes. If he pushed her now, he would lose her forever. He would lose them forever. "Okay," he said hoarsely. "Okay, Amy." He pushed himself off the garage wall, his body feeling heavier than it ever had under the weight of a fire hose. He didn't look back as he walked down the driveway to his truck. He felt her eyes on his back, a burning accusation. He climbed into the cab, the smell of stale coffee and old smoke suddenly suffocating him. As he turned the key, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The screen door had opened again, and the 2 boys, Jacob and Nicholas, were standing on the porch, their faces pressed against the mesh, watching the stranger with their father's face drive away. Brian drove back to the motel where he had booked a room for the night, a cheap place on the outskirts of town with flickering neon signs and paper-thin walls. He threw his duffel bag on the bed and walked into the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. He stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror, the crow's feet around his eyes, the scar on his chin from a falling branch during the Yosemite fire. He didn't recognize the man staring back at him. He was a hero to strangers, but a coward to the people who mattered most. He didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of the bed, his mind replaying the scene in the driveway over and over again. The look on Amy's face, the twins' questions, the feeling of utter helplessness. He had spent his adult life walking into infernos. But this was a different kind of fire. A slow burn that was consuming him from the inside out. The next morning, he woke up with a headache and a resolve he hadn't known he possessed. He wasn't going to run this time. Amy had said to leave to give her time, not to disappear. He drove to the local diner, not the one where he'd had coffee, but a different one. Anonymously tucked away and ordered breakfast, his eyes glued to his phone, waiting for a text, a call, anything. The hours stretched on, agonizing and silent. By noon, he couldn't take it anymore. He drove back towards Amy's neighborhood, parking his truck a block away from the blue house, just close enough to see the roof line over the trees. He sat there for 2 hours, watching the street like a stakeout, until he saw them. Amy's minivan pulled into the driveway, and the two boys tumbled out of the back seat, laughing, carrying soccer bags. Brian felt a pang of jealousy so sharp it was physical. He should have been the one picking them up from practice. He should have been the one listening to their stories about the game. He watched them go inside, the door closing on the life he wanted more than anything. He was about to give up and drive back to the motel when his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "They want to know who you are. Meet us at the park on Elm Street in an hour. Don't be late." Brian stared at the message, his heart leaping into his throat. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a welcome home, but it was an open door, a crack in the wall that had separated them for a decade. He started the truck, the engine roaring to life. He had faced down walls of flame that reached the sky, but he knew that the hardest thing he would ever do was walk into that park and look his sons in the eye and tell them the truth. The Elm Street Park was bathed in the golden, hazy light of late afternoon, the kind of light that usually signaled the end of a long, lazy summer day. For Brian, it felt like the executioner's spotlight. He sat on a peeling green park bench, his hands clasped tightly between his knees, watching the entrance. He had arrived 20 minutes early, unable to sit still in the motel room, his stomach churning with the volatility he hadn't felt since his very first wildfire deployment. Every time a car drove past, he flinched. He was a man who regularly rappelled out of helicopters into burning forests, yet the prospect of facing two 9-year-old boys and telling them the truth terrified him into a state of near paralysis. He had rehearsed speeches in his head, explanations about duty and calling and youthful stupidity, but sitting there in the quiet park, they all sounded like hollow excuses. Then he saw them. Amy's minivan pulled up to the curb, and the side door slid open. Jacob and Nicholas spilled out, their earlier energy replaced by a hesitant, shuffling gait. They were wearing matching striped polo shirts, their hair neatly combed, looking like they were headed to church rather than a park. Amy followed, closing the door with a definitive thud. She wore large sunglasses that hid her eyes, but the rigid set of her jaw told Brian everything he needed to know. This was Uintah reunion. It was a reckoning. They approached the bench slowly. The boys stopped about 10 feet away, standing shoulder to shoulder, a united front against the intruder. Amy stopped beside them, crossing her arms over her chest. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the chirping of crickets signaling the approaching twilight. "You came," Amy said flatly, removing her sunglasses to reveal eyes rimmed with red. "I said I wouldn't be late," Brian replied, his voice sounding rusty. He looked at the boys, who were staring at his boots, anywhere but his face. "Hi, Jacob." They mumbled a greeting, still not looking up. Amy took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Boys," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "You know how we talked about your dad?" Jacob looked up then, his eyes sharp and accusing. Brian winced. The word felt like an insult now. "I did," Amy said softly. "And he is." She paused, looking at Brian, giving him the floor. This was the moment. There was no turning back. Brian slowly got down on one knee, bringing himself to their eye level. The gravel dug into his jeans, a grounding sensation. "Jacob McAllis," he began, struggling to keep his voice steady. "The man you saw yesterday. The man who looks like you." He took another breath, the hardest one he'd ever taken. The reaction wasn't explosive. It was worse. It was a profound, confused silence. Nicholas took a half step behind Amy, Jacob just stared, his brow furrowed as if trying to solve a complex math problem. But you left, Jacob said finally, his voice devoid of emotion, just stating a fact. I did, Brian admitted, looking him straight in the eye, and it was the biggest mistake of my life. I didn't know about you two then. If I had, Amy interjected quietly, her voice laced with doubt, would you really have stayed, Brian? Brian looked at her, then back to the boys. Honesty was the only weapon he had left. I don't know, he confessed. I was scared back then. I was selfish. I thought I had to run away to be someone important. But I was wrong. Nicholas asked from behind his mother's leg, his voice small and fearful. No, Brian said fiercely. Never again. I want to be here. I want to get to know you guys. We don't need you, Jacob interrupted, his chin jutting out defensively. We have Mom. The rejection stung, sharp and deep. Brian nodded slowly. I know you have your mom, and she's done an amazing job. You guys are incredible, and I know I don't deserve a place in your life right now. The tension was palpable. A standoff between a repentant father and the sons he had abandoned. Amy looked like she might throw up. She suggested weakly, needing to break the intensity. Go on the swings. The boys hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave their mother alone with the stranger who claimed to be their dad, but the allure of the playground was strong. They slowly drifted toward a large, elaborate climbing structure made of ropes and towering wooden walls. Amy sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving a wide expanse of green-painted wood between them. They're confused, Brian. They're angry, I know, he said, watching them climb. I don't expect that. They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the boys navigate the structure. Jacob was fearless, scrambling to the highest point with ease. Nicholas was more cautious, careful with his footing. He was about 3/4 of the way up a sheer rock-climbing wall when he slipped. His foot lost purchase on a plastic hold, and he swung wildly for a second before catching himself on a rope. He froze, clinging to the wall, about 12 feet off the ground.